Hello and welcome. Lockdown 4.0 is all set to lift on the 31st of May in most parts of the country. As that happens, even if it doesn't happen in its entirety, many of us will want to get back to our normal lives to the extent that it can be normal. The question, therefore, is what is normal when it comes to moving around, and what do we know of the virus and its ability to jump or transmit from person to person so that we can be prepared? And should we be taking extreme precautions, or better still, how do we calibrate our own fear of what can happen and what cannot? To discuss this, I'm joined by Dr. Ambarish Satwik, who's written a very interesting note to his community members in Delhi, informing them about how to and how not to approach COVID in the days going forward, and the inevitability that all of us will get it at some point or the other. Dr. Satwik is a vascular and endovascular surgeon at Delhi's Sir Ganga Ram Hospital. So tell us, what you fundamentally say that basically we should obviously, one is to understand this virus better. But in order to do that, we have to ride the storm. Explain that, please.
No, I think what that means is that we can't, we have to go on living. And as we go about our lives, the only thing we should be aware of is that there should be a ritualized form of alertness and wariness of the disease all around us. And we have to take adequate precautions. And there has to be some amount of neurosis about being concerned about not getting infected. And this is an ongoing process. What that means is that now that lockdowns will be eased, as people will start going to offices, will start commuting, perhaps public transportation is likely to open, the chances of dissemination of the disease it's going to increase. There's no doubt. There's just one way forward, and we're clearly on the ascendant arm of the curve. Most of the oxygen seems to be past its peak, but we're just on the ascendant. So this is when it really starts hitting us, and no amount of complacency is going to help here. So we have to be constantly alert, constantly vigilant. Yes.
Right. So if we go out, and you're also arguing that we have to assume that we would get infected. And I mean, how do I sort of, as a layperson, react to that?
So I think, look, I sent out a message to a neighborhood group, basically to assuage their sentiment, because there was a positive case found somewhere, and there was widespread panic and misapprehension. So what I'm trying to say is that in the absence of a vaccine and the absence of a drug, the only way out of this, the only way this is going to end, is for the community to acquire what is known as herd immunity. And for that, a significant majority of people will have to be infected. There's a possibility. So New York, if I'm not mistaken, sometime, I think in early May, did a serological study of its population, New York City, and they found that about 20 to 22% people had already been infected. They were seropositive. They had been seroconverted. So what that means is that these people have had an unsolicited encounter with the virus. A lot of us probably have already been infected, because where I work, we're routinely testing all admissions because we want to be absolutely certain that there aren't any cross-infections. And we find that a whole lot of completely asymptomatic people are testing positive. They have no clue about this. They're not aware that they're carrying the virus or spewing it when they're going about. So when you start offices, you have to assume that every person you interact with is an asymptomatic carrier. The highest chance of acquiring the infection is what is known as intramural transmission in an office space, in a dwelling where there's a shared space, where there's central air conditioning, when you're in close proximity to people. That's when intramural transmission happens. And you have to assume the worst. You have to assume that every person you interact with is potentially an asymptomatic COVID carrier, because symptomatic patients are likely to stay at home. Patients with fever, any kind of ailment, are likely to stay home. It's the people who are completely asymptomatic who will be up and about and doing their jobs. So you have to assume the worst and protect yourself.
Right, and the premise for what you're saying is also that, as you said, this disease has spread far wider and deeper than we perhaps assume, and what the numbers are showing us. I was interviewing Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who's a professor of medicine at Stanford, this last month, and he was saying the same thing. And of course, when he said it in March, a lot of people jumped on him. But now this seems to be the growing, let's say, consensus that a lot more people are carrying it. I spoke to another doctor in Mumbai last week who said the same thing, that anyone who's walking into their OPD is testing positive. So that was somewhat anecdotal, but in line with what you're saying. So tell us about this herd immunity. What does that mean? And I think there is some sort of confusion on how we should be interpreting it.
So I think, first of all, we must understand that herd immunity isn't real immunity. You acquire immunity when you've been exposed to a pathogen, a virus or any pathogen, and you develop antibodies. These antibodies will stay on for a significant length of time and protect you from the same pathogen if it were to try and attack you. Herd immunity isn't this. It's not immunity that you acquire by osmosis or by interaction. It's when a significant majority in any community is either vaccinated, but in this case, we don't have a vaccine. So a significant majority is infected, and there's a minority that is still preserved and uninfected, not exposed to the virus. And now when a new individual gets infected, the virus wants to move on because the virus needs the human host for survival. It cannot survive very long outside human beings. So when it wants to move on, it's going to encounter immune individuals, because the statistical probability of this infected person being surrounded by previously infected and now immune individuals is much higher than the possibility of the virus encountering an uninfected individual. So in a sense, it's the statistical probability that the virus is not going to find another host and is going to wither away. And therefore, the uninfected minority are protected by a herd of the previously infected and now immune majority. That is herd immunity. It's not real immunity in any sense.
Right, and that explanation yeah, go ahead.
Real immunity only comes from either getting infected or getting successfully vaccinated.
Right, and that's very useful to know, doctor. So the other point you made, that the people that you were testing in your hospital, because I'm assuming you're examining them for other conditions, are all testing positive. So anecdotally, if you were to add that up over the last 6 to 8 weeks, what is it telling you in terms of data?
Look, I think, and I cannot speak for other hospitals, and I think, sure, frankly, you have to put any data coming out of this with some amount of suspicion, because there isn't a central collating authority who knows anything about what's going on. It's too granular and it's very difficult to aggregate data. But I think in any large tertiary referral hospital that's treating a whole lot of people, I'd say the test positivity rate is going to be anywhere between, I'd say, 15 to 18%. That's what my assumption is. That's a fairly high test positivity rate. It's almost 1 in 5 testing positive. But you must realize that here you have a whole lot of people who have influenza-like illnesses and COVID-like symptoms showing up, but also a whole lot of asymptomatic people. And most hospitals at this stage are not testing patients when they're being examined. They're only testing patients where they're being admitted for something else, or possibly for a surgical procedure, to make sure that there isn't any cross-infection or any intramural transmission within hospitals. That's why they're testing them.
Right. And, about 2 months ago, we were also thinking and hoping that, maybe we Indians are a little more immune, or likely more immune, and there's summer which is going to be around the corner, and that's going to save us somewhat. And there have been studies that have been going on this all over, including at MIT. So what's your sense? I mean, I know that, I cannot hold you to a scientific response, but I know that you have referred to this in your article.
Yes, I don't believe that there is any innate inherent immunity amongst Indians. I think we're just as susceptible to the organism. It's possible that climatic factors might be affecting the transmissibility of the virus between individuals, but I don't believe that the Indian stock in any way is resistant or immune. Healthcare workers and citizens of Indian extraction all over the world are dying by the hordes and being infected by the hordes. So, there's absolutely no basis to this assumption, and there's no evidence, more importantly.
United States, for instance, I was talking to the president of the Association of Physicians of Indian Origin, and he was saying that most of the Indian Americans who are dying or have been severely affected by COVID are actually doctors and people in medicine because they are at the front lines, whereas most Indians are actually, or Indian Americans are actually not exposed because of obviously the conditions they live in, which are better than maybe others.
That's right. The thing to be understood here is that there's some basis to the theory that it's the viral load that determines the severity of infection in any individual. What that means is that how much virus is being inhaled by the affected individual. And most doctors who are in the trenches, working in ICUs, are exposed to an aerosolized form of the virus because their procedures are being done which have an effect of aerosolizing the virus. The simple act of intubating a patient to put them on a ventilator or to give non-invasive ventilation aerosolizes the virus. And this is then airborne. It stays for significantly longer than droplets. And therefore, the amount of and the load of virus that's been inhaled by healthcare workers, nurses, and doctors is much, much higher than what you can get from what is known as transmission by fomites. So therefore, you find that a lot of healthcare workers are likely to get infected and have been infected, and also it affects significantly the mortality amongst healthcare workers because it's much more viral load and therefore a much more severe form of infection.
Right. Last two questions. So one is, how are you seeing let's say the situation unfold for high density regions like Mumbai, where I am right now? And secondly, what's your advice to your patients or your community members about what are the 2 or 3 things that they should be at all times most cautious about and should follow rigorously?
So I think in the middle of a pandemic, particularly amongst dense cities, you have to assume the worst, as I said. In hospitals much before this, when we first started seeing HIV infections, you had to employ universal precautions, which meant double gloves to make sure that you're not pricked while operating and so on. So you have to assume that every patient is positive. So it's the same principle in the middle of a pandemic. You have to assume that everyone you interact, particularly when you're in the ascendant arm of the curve and you're not past the peak, you have to assume that everybody around you is an asymptomatic carrier. That's the best way forward. It's an annoying kind of neurosis, if I might use that word, that is going to protect you. A very high level of ritualized alertness and a form of neurosis that's constantly at the back of your mind. That's going to be the revenant that's going to save you. And, frankly, if you ask me where this is going, it's very difficult to predict. But my sense is, and I don't wish to make a political statement here, but my sense is that I think we should stop looking at the dashboard. The dashboard has no meaning because the dashboard never will factor in the vast swathes of asymptomatic people. I'm also hearing reports that cemeteries and burial grounds, the number of deaths that are being tended to in cemeteries and burial grounds with COVID precautions, with COVID protocol being followed, is about many times higher than the death figures being reported. So obviously there is a certain amount of unreliability to the narrative that is being trotted out. And therefore, it's very difficult to make mathematical predictions about doubling rates and other things. And therefore, I'm wary of that. Because...
Right. Last question. So is all of this going to be the subject of your next book?
No. Well, I don't know. Currently, there's practically no time for writing. There's practically no time to collect your thoughts, actually. But yes, in my novel, I wrote a story which was reissued and published online recently, which was about the plague of Mumbai in 1896 and about Voldemort Hafkin coming in and being summoned to prepare a vaccine. And that's a very interesting story because it was written in 2005, but we're seeing precisely a repeat in terms of societal anxiety, in terms of segregation, in terms of all the processes that are being deployed by the state exactly the same being trotted out by a current
Right.
administration. So it's
Great. Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Dr. Satwik. Thank you for your insights, which I hope a lot of people read or watch. And I do wish you all the best in this continuing fight. Thank you very much for joining us.